For centuries, the fall of the Roman Empire has been explained in deceptively simple terms. Textbooks often point to barbarian invasions, the sack of Rome, and waves of outsiders overwhelming a once great civilization. Yet this explanation raises immediate contradictions. How could an empire that ruled millions, commanded unmatched military power, and shaped law, language, and governance across continents collapse because of scattered tribal migrations? Why did Rome survive repeated invasions for centuries, only to disintegrate when it still possessed armies, cities, and wealth? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did many Romans themselves seem to accept, even enable, the empire's decline? If invasion alone caused Rome's fall, why did the empire weaken long before the invaders arrived? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. By the 4th century, Rome still appeared formidable on the surface. Its borders stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Its cities were connected by roads unmatched in scale and durability. Roman law governed daily life, imperial bureaucracy collected taxes, and emperors issued decrees that shaped the fate of millions. And yet, beneath this appearance of continuity, something had already begun to fracture. Long before the sack of Rome in 410 or the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476, Roman writers themselves were describing a society under strain. They did not speak first of invasions, but of decay, political paralysis, economic exhaustion, and a loss of civic cohesion. This raises an important question. If Rome fell because it was invaded, why did so many of its problems originate internally? By the 3rd century, the empire was already experiencing a cycle of crisis. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Military commanders were proclaimed rulers by their troops only to be assassinated months later. Civil wars became routine. Between 235 and 284, Rome had more than 20 emperors, many of whom died violently. This instability did not merely disrupt governance, it eroded trust in imperial authority itself. Loyalty shifted from institutions to individuals, and the idea of a shared Roman future began to weaken. The military, often portrayed as Rome's greatest strength, became one of its deepest vulnerabilities. To maintain control over vast territories, Rome relied on enormous standing armies. Funding them required heavy taxation, which strained both urban populations and rural landowners. As tax burdens increased, small farmers abandoned their land, cities shrank, and economic activity contracted. In response, emperors debased the currency, reducing silver content to pay soldiers. This triggered inflation, undermining confidence in Roman money and commerce. By the time invasions intensified, Rome's economy had already been hollowed out from within. Official explanations often emphasize external pressure, Goths, Vandals, Huns, but contemporary Roman sources reveal a deeper anxiety. Writers like Ammianus Marcellinus described a society obsessed with luxury, spectacle, and personal advancement, while public service declined. Senatorial elites withdrew from civic responsibilities, retreating to private estates where they avoided taxation and imperial obligations. Local administration, once the backbone of Roman governance, weakened as elites sought exemption rather than engagement. This internal disengagement made imperial authority increasingly dependent on coercion rather than consent. Some historians argue that Rome's size itself became a liability. Governing such a vast empire required constant compromise between central authority and local autonomy. When communication was slow and resources uneven, emperors increasingly ruled through emergency measures rather than stable institutions. Laws multiplied, but enforcement weakened. Corruption flourished not because Romans were uniquely immoral, but because the system incentivized survival over integrity. Officials extracted wealth where they could, knowing their tenure might be brief. Over time, this normalized dysfunction. The role of the military further complicates the invasion narrative. By the late Empire, Rome increasingly recruited soldiers from outside its traditional citizen base. These recruits were often labeled barbarians, but many served loyally for decades. They fought Rome's wars, defended its borders, and rose to high command. This raises another question. If barbarian invasions destroyed Rome, why were so many so-called barbarians already inside the empire, wearing Roman uniforms and defending Roman interests? The line between invader and insider had become blurred long before the empire fell. This blurring was not accidental. Rome had long relied on integration as a survival strategy. Conquered peoples were gradually absorbed, granted citizenship, and incorporated into Roman society. In earlier centuries, this strengthened the empire, but by the late period, integration occurred under very different conditions. Instead of confident expansion, Rome was negotiating from weakness. Entire groups were settled within imperial borders in exchange for military service, often retaining their own leaders and customs. This created semi-autonomous enclaves that owed loyalty to Rome conditionally, not instinctively. Religion added another layer to Rome's transformation. The rise of Christianity reshaped imperial identity in profound ways. Pagan rituals that once reinforced civic unity lost their central role. Christian leaders emphasized spiritual allegiance over imperial loyalty, sometimes openly criticizing state authority. Some historians argue that Christianity weakened Rome by diverting loyalty away from the state. Others counter that it offered moral cohesion during collapse. What is clear is that Rome's ideological foundation was shifting at the same time its political structure was destabilizing. The empire was no longer unified by a single worldview. Meanwhile, environmental and demographic pressures quietly intensified Rome's problems. Evidence suggests periods of climate instability affected agriculture, leading to food shortages and migration. Plagues reduced population, shrinking the tax base and manpower pool. These were not dramatic events like invasions, but slow-moving crises that weakened Rome's resilience. When external shocks finally arrived, the system was already fragile. This context changes how we interpret invasions. The sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric's Goths shocked contemporaries, but it did not immediately end the empire. Rome had been sacked before and survived. What made this event different was not the violence itself, but the empire's inability to recover. The administrative machinery faltered, revenues declined further, and provinces began to drift away. Invasion became a symptom of weakness rather than its sole cause. Eastern Rome offers a revealing comparison. The Eastern Roman Empire faced similar invasions, religious shifts, and economic pressures, yet it survived for nearly 1,000 years longer. Constantinople remained wealthy, administratively cohesive, and strategically defensible. This suggests that invasion alone cannot explain Rome's fall. If barbarians destroyed Rome, why did they fail to destroy the Eastern Empire under similar conditions? The difference lies less in who attacked Rome and more in how Rome functioned internally. By the 5th century, many Roman elites no longer believed the empire could be saved. They negotiated with invaders, served under new rulers, and adapted to changing power structures. This was not sudden betrayal, but pragmatic survival. When imperial authority no longer protected property or stability, loyalty shifted naturally. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It dissolved as people stopped investing in its future. This gradual disengagement is often overlooked because it lacks drama. Invasions make for clear narratives. Internal rot does not. Yet the evidence points toward a long process of erosion. Political instability, economic strain, social fragmentation, and ideological transformation all preceded the final collapse. Invasions accelerated the process, but they did not initiate it. Understanding the fall of Rome requires resisting simple explanations. It was neither purely an external conquest nor a sudden moral collapse. It was a complex interaction between internal weakness and external pressure, unfolding over centuries rather than years. To see Rome's fall clearly, we must look not only at who crossed its borders, but at what was happening inside those borders long before they were crossed. As we continue, the question is no longer whether Rome fell to invasion or internal decay, but how these forces fed into each other, slowly transforming the empire from a dominant power into a memory long before the last emperor was removed from his throne. To move beyond the image of Rome collapsing under sudden external assault, we need to examine how Roman society itself was changing in ways that reduced its ability to respond to crisis. One of the most significant transformations occurred in the relationship between the state and its citizens. In the early empire, Roman identity was tied to participation, service in local government, military duty, and public life. By the late empire, this relationship had become increasingly coercive. Laws bound farmers to their land, workers to their professions, and sons to their fathers' occupations. These measures were intended to stabilize the economy and ensure tax collection, but they had an unintended consequence. They turned citizenship into a burden rather than a privilege. This shift mattered deeply when external pressure intensified. A population that feels invested in the survival of the state is more likely to defend it. A population that feels trapped by it may not. Roman legal codes from the 4th and 5th centuries reveal an empire struggling to compel compliance rather than inspire loyalty. Tax collectors were feared, not respected. Soldiers were quartered among civilians, often extracting resources by force. The state increasingly appeared as an extractor rather than a protector, especially in the western provinces. Land ownership illustrates this transformation clearly. As small farmers collapsed under tax pressure and insecurity, large estates expanded. Wealthy landowners accumulated vast holdings worked by tenant farmers and semi-free laborers. These estates became economically self-sufficient, reducing dependence on imperial markets and infrastructure. Over time, loyalty shifted from the distant emperor to the local landlord who offered protection and stability. This did not happen overnight, but it quietly undermined the central state. When invaders arrived, many rural communities found that accommodation was less disruptive than resistance. This dynamic complicates the invasion narrative even further. Groups traditionally labeled as invaders were often invited in, settled as federates, or employed as allies. The Visigoths, for example, initially entered Roman territory seeking refuge from the Huns. Their mistreatment by Roman officials, exploitation, starvation, and corruption triggered rebellion. The catastrophic Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378, where Emperor Valens was killed, is often framed as a military disaster caused by barbarian invasion. Yet Roman sources make clear that the roots of the conflict lay in administrative failure. The empire couldn't even manage the integration of people who wanted to live within it. After Adrianople, Rome did not suddenly collapse. Instead, it adapted in ways that further blurred the line between Roman and non-Roman. Barbarian generals rose to the highest levels of command. Armies became ethnically mixed, united less by Roman identity than by loyalty to their leaders. Some historians interpret this as decay. Others see it as continuity through transformation. What is undeniable is that the traditional mechanisms of Roman cohesion, citizenship, law, and shared civic culture were weakening. Political authority also fractured in more subtle ways. Emperors increasingly ruled from fortified capitals rather than moving through the provinces. Court politics became insular, dominated by palace officials and rival factions. Decision-making slowed, and local crises were often addressed too late or not at all. This disconnect between center and periphery made coordinated defense difficult. Provinces began to experience imperial power as distant and unreliable, reinforcing the appeal of local solutions. Economic contraction continued throughout this period. Trade networks shrank, coinage became scarce, and barter replaced cash in many regions. This was not a complete economic collapse, but a retreat from complexity. Cities declined in size and function, no longer acting as engines of administration and culture. Urban decay mattered because cities had been crucial to Roman governance. Without vibrant urban centers, tax collection, legal administration, and military supply all suffered. The empire's skeleton remained, but its connective tissue weakened. At the same time, cultural attitudes toward power were changing. Roman literature of the late Empire often expresses nostalgia for an idealized past and pessimism about the present. Writers lamented moral decline, corruption, and loss of discipline. While such complaints are common in many societies, their persistence suggests a widespread sense that the system was no longer working as intended. This psychological dimension is difficult to quantify, but it matters. Societies that believe in their future behave differently from those that expect decline. Religion again plays a complex role here. Christianity did not destroy Rome, but it did alter priorities. Christian leaders sometimes opposed traditional civic rituals and redirected charitable resources toward the church rather than the state. Bishops emerged as powerful local figures, often mediating between communities and authorities. In times of crisis, people increasingly turned to religious institutions for support rather than imperial ones. This shift filled a vacuum, but it also signaled a loss of confidence in imperial structures. Meanwhile, the empire's frontiers were no longer zones of expansion, but of constant negotiation. Fortifications multiplied, but they were manned by fewer troops. Defense became reactive rather than proactive. When pressure increased, Rome lacked the reserves to respond decisively. The idea of a single, unified defense strategy gave way to localized arrangements, treaties, and compromises. These measures bought time, but they also normalized fragmentation. The Western Empire was particularly vulnerable because of its economic geography. Compared to the East, it was poorer, less urbanized, and more dependent on agriculture. The East benefited from wealthy cities, trade routes, and a stable tax base. When crises hit, the East could absorb shocks that the West could not. This divergence challenges any explanation that treats the Roman Empire as a single entity collapsing uniformly. The fall of the West was not inevitable simply because Rome was Rome. It reflected specific structural weaknesses. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire still existed on paper, but its authority was increasingly symbolic. Laws were issued, emperors crowned, and titles maintained, yet real power often lay elsewhere. Military strongmen, local elites, and foreign kings exercised control on the ground. When Rome was sacked again in 455, the shock was less than in 410, not because the violence was less severe, but because expectations had already shifted. The empire was no longer assumed to be permanent. This gradual normalization of decline is perhaps the clearest sign of internal erosion. Societies rarely collapse the moment they are attacked. They collapse when their members no longer believe in their institutions. Invasions expose weakness, but they do not create it from nothing. By the time the Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476, most people living within its former borders had already adapted to a post-imperial world. As we move further into this history, the question becomes sharper. If internal transformation set the stage and invasion merely accelerated the process, then Rome's fall was less a dramatic end than a long transition. To understand it fully, we must examine how Roman authority was gradually replaced, not destroyed, by new forms of power, identity, and order. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a single coherent entity, but a patchwork of competing authorities, some Roman, some barbarian. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Burgundians had established semi-independent kingdoms within imperial borders. These groups were often initially allies, foederati or settlers granted land in exchange for military service. Over time, however, their loyalty became conditional and their autonomy expanded. What contemporary observers might have called invasion was frequently negotiated settlement, highlighting again that the empire was not overrun from the outside so much as it was restructured from within. The political center of the Western Empire had also shifted dramatically. Rome itself was no longer the sole seat of power. Emperors moved to Ravenna, Mediolanum, and other fortified cities closer to military resources. This relocation reflects both strategic necessity and the weakening of traditional Roman civic identity. Proximity to troops became more important than proximity to the people or to symbolic sites. As a result, the imperial image persisted even as practical authority diminished. Citizens increasingly looked to local rulers, landlords, or military leaders for protection rather than to distant emperors. Military organization itself was transformed. In the early empire, legions were professional, loyal, and integrated into the broader civic structure. By the late empire, legions were often recruited from barbarian populations, and their loyalty was personal rather than institutional. Generals sometimes became kingmakers, installing and deposing emperors according to immediate tactical advantage. These arrangements stabilized some regions temporarily, but undermined systemic cohesion. When crises occurred, local commanders prioritized their own interests or those of their troops over imperial policy. In this sense, the Western Empire fell not simply because it was attacked, but because its defensive structures no longer functioned as a unified system. Economic disintegration continued in parallel. Agricultural production, already strained by taxation and demographic decline, suffered further from insecurity and land fragmentation. Trade networks contracted, reducing the flow of goods and coinage across the empire. Urban centers, which had once been hubs of administration and commerce, shrank dramatically. Cities that were still inhabited often lacked the infrastructure to support imperial officials or large garrisons. Money became scarce, bartering grew, and tax collection faltered. By the time external threats intensified, the empire lacked the fiscal and logistical capacity to respond effectively. The interaction between internal weakness and external pressure became particularly evident in the sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Prosper of Aquitaine, emphasize not only the violence, but the absence of meaningful resistance. Many Romans had already relocated, capitulated, or negotiated survival through tribute. The Vandals were not invincible. They succeeded partly because Roman institutions had already been hollowed out. By this stage, the empire's structural decay had created opportunities that no external force had to invent. Religious transformation continued to shape Roman society during this period. Christianity had become the state religion under Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century, changing the ideological framework of authority. Bishops and church institutions increasingly assumed roles that were once the responsibility of imperial administrators. Churches provided welfare, mediation, and moral guidance. While this stabilized communities locally, it also shifted loyalty away from imperial structures. By the 5th century, many people derived security and identity more from their religious institutions than from the emperor, further eroding the cultural cohesion that had once buttressed Rome's power. Demographic pressures amplified the impact of internal decay. Population losses from plague, famine, and migration reduced the pool of soldiers and taxpayers. Rural depopulation contributed to the growth of self-sufficient estates as smallholders abandoned marginal lands. These estates, while productive locally, were disconnected from the imperial economy, weakening centralized control. Labor shortages forced higher taxes or coerced service, which in turn prompted more flight and local autonomy. The empire became increasingly a collection of loosely connected regions rather than a cohesive polity. By contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire faced similar demographic and economic pressures but retained stronger institutional resilience. Constantinople's strategic location, wealth, and centralized administration allowed it to manage invasions and internal crises more effectively. The East invested in fortified cities, bureaucratic continuity, and diplomatic arrangements that absorbed shocks rather than allowing them to cascade into systemic collapse. The survival of the East demonstrates that internal cohesion, rather than the absence of external enemies, was critical to longevity. The final deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 is often portrayed as the definitive end of the Western Roman Empire, yet the practical implications were limited. Power had already shifted to barbarian kings who ruled according to Roman law, employed Roman administrators, and relied on Roman infrastructure. In many ways, the empire continued in adapted form through these successor states. The transition was not abrupt. It was a gradual transfer of authority from central Roman institutions to hybrid local structures. This highlights the subtlety of internal decline as a factor in Rome's fall. Military defeats, often emphasized in popular narratives, cannot be fully understood without this context. Losses at battles like Adrianople, the Catalonian Plains, or the Vandals crossing into North Africa were serious, but they were symptoms of broader systemic problems. Armies were fragmented, loyalties were divided, and command structures were inconsistent. Even when victorious, Roman forces could not restore the authority or cohesion that had eroded over centuries. By the late 5th century, military action alone could not preserve the empire. Examining the fall of Rome in this light challenges the conventional invasion-focused narrative. External pressures, barbarian migrations, Hunnic movements, and frontier raids certainly mattered, but they were accelerants rather than root causes. Rome's collapse was prefigured by internal decay, political fragmentation, economic contraction, social disengagement, and ideological transformation. When invaders arrived, they encountered a system already compromised, capable neither of coordinated defense nor of resilient recovery. This perspective also reframes our understanding of historical causation. Rather than seeing Rome's fall as a single dramatic event, it appears as a slow-motion process of institutional unraveling. Each internal weakness, bureaucratic inefficiency, fiscal stress, military decentralization, or ideological shift, interacted with others to create vulnerability. Invasions were consequential, but only because the system was already brittle. The fall of Rome was a story of cumulative erosion, not sudden conquest. As we proceed, the next question is how Rome's transformation influenced the post-imperial world. The Western Empire's decay facilitated the rise of new political entities, hybrid cultural forms, and enduring social structures. Understanding the interplay of internal weakness and external pressure provides insight not only into the empire's demise, but into the long-term evolution of Europe itself. The story of Rome's fall, therefore, is not only a tale of collapse, it is a narrative about adaptation, transition, and the subtle ways in which internal decay can open the door to new historical realities. By the late 5th century, the landscape of Western Europe had been fundamentally reshaped by the combination of internal decline and external settlement. Barbarian leaders such as Odoacer in Italy, Theodoric in the Ostrogothic kingdom, and the Visigothic rulers in Gaul were not simply invaders imposing foreign rule, they were inheritors of Roman structures. They adopted Roman titles, maintained taxation systems, employed Roman administrators, and even used Latin for official communication. In effect, they ruled over Roman populations using Roman frameworks. This continuity suggests that the empire's collapse was as much a political transformation as a military defeat. The institutions and cultural foundations of Rome persisted, even under new leadership, indicating that internal decay had eroded the authority of the Western Roman state long before the last emperor was deposed. This transformation extended beyond political structures to social and economic systems. Large estates, once integrated into imperial networks, became the backbone of local economies. Landowners exercised increasing autonomy, maintaining security, administering justice, and managing agricultural production without relying on central authority. Peasant communities adapted to this reality by aligning their loyalty to immediate protectors rather than distant emperors. This process of devolution allowed for relative stability even as central power eroded, reinforcing the argument that Rome's fall was driven internally as much as externally. Military organization also evolved under these conditions. Roman legions, traditionally disciplined, centralized forces, were replaced in many regions by federated armies under barbarian commanders. These armies operated semi-independently, balancing obligations to Rome with local priorities. The integration of barbarian soldiers was a pragmatic response to manpower shortages, but it also diluted the cohesion of imperial forces. By the mid-5th century, battlefield loyalty was often tied to individual commanders rather than the state, making coordinated defense difficult. When crises arose, responses were localized and fragmented, illustrating how internal institutional weakening compounded vulnerability to external threats. Religion continued to reshape civic and cultural life. Christianity, now firmly established, altered conceptions of authority and community. Bishops and church networks increasingly mediated disputes, provided welfare, and administered justice. These religious institutions offered stability in a world where imperial structures were faltering, yet they also shifted allegiance away from the emperor. The spiritual authority of bishops often rivaled or complemented political authority, creating a dual system of governance. In many communities, the church became the primary locus of loyalty and identity, signaling a profound transformation in the social fabric of the empire. Demographics and public health played less visible but equally significant roles. Plagues, population decline, and migration reduced both the tax base and the pool of military recruits. Urban centers contracted, trade networks fragmented, and regional economies became increasingly self-contained. These demographic pressures weakened the empire's ability to sustain centralized authority and complicated any attempt to mount an organized response to external threats. While invaders were often portrayed as decisive factors, it was these internal stresses that determined whether the empire could absorb or resist incursions. Economic disintegration further amplified these vulnerabilities. Coinage was debased, inflation increased, and trade declined. Cities that had once served as administrative and commercial hubs shrank, reducing connectivity and resource flow. Local elites filled the resulting power vacuum, asserting control over taxation, security, and production. By the time external groups sought to exploit imperial weakness, the West was already a decentralized network of semi-autonomous regions. In this context, invasions were accelerants, exploiting conditions that internal decay had already created. The comparison with the Eastern Empire is illuminating. Constantinople retained strong administrative institutions, a reliable tax base, and a strategic location that allowed it to absorb both demographic shocks and military threats. The East also maintained greater bureaucratic continuity, ensuring that even when local elites gained influence, central authority remained operational. This contrast demonstrates that the fate of Rome was not determined solely by external pressures. Rather, it was the internal capacity to adapt, enforce law, and maintain cohesion that determined resilience. By examining the fall of the Western Empire through this lens, the narrative shifts from sudden catastrophe to gradual transformation. The traditional focus on sackings, invasions, and military defeats obscures the slow erosion of authority, legitimacy, and cohesion that truly destabilized the state. Rome's institutions did not fail overnight. They deteriorated incrementally, undermined by fiscal strain, political fragmentation, social disengagement, and shifting loyalties. When invaders arrived, they encountered a system already compromised and were able to establish authority more easily than a fully functioning imperial structure would have permitted. This perspective also reshapes our understanding of historical causation. Collapse is rarely the result of a single event. It emerges from complex interactions between structural weaknesses and external shocks. In the case of Rome, internal rot created vulnerabilities that invasions exploited. Military losses were serious, but they were consequential precisely because internal cohesion had already been compromised. Political authority, economic stability, military organization, and social identity all weakened over time, producing a state that could no longer respond effectively to crisis. The story of Rome's fall also informs our understanding of continuity and adaptation. Many Roman institutions survived in modified forms under barbarian rule, demonstrating that collapse was not synonymous with annihilation. Legal codes, administrative practices, and cultural norms persisted, forming the foundation for successor states. This continuity underscores the role of internal decay in facilitating adaptation. Where Rome retained strength, its systems endured. Where decay was profound, transformation was inevitable. Invasions merely completed processes already underway. By the end of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist as a unified political entity, yet Roman culture, law, and organizational practices persisted throughout Europe, influencing kingdoms that followed. The fall was not a singular event, but a centuries-long process in which internal weaknesses gradually eroded the empire's ability to function. External groups were critical to the narrative, but their impact must be understood in the context of systemic decline. Rome fell because it had already been weakened from within, and invaders exploited rather than created that vulnerability. In sum, the fall of Rome was a multidimensional process: political fragmentation, economic contraction, social disengagement, military transformation, religious change, and demographic stress interacted over centuries to produce a state increasingly incapable of defending itself or maintaining authority. Barbarian incursions accelerated the final dissolution, but they did not originate the weaknesses that made collapse possible. Understanding Rome's fall requires seeing beyond dramatic events to the subtle, cumulative erosion of internal structures, a process that fundamentally reshaped Western Europe and set the stage for the medieval world. By the time Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, the Western Roman Empire had already been fragmented for decades, and its collapse was less a cataclysm than the culmination of long-term trends. Local rulers, military strongmen, and barbarian kings had assumed functions that the emperor could no longer perform, including taxation, defense, and law enforcement. Rome's institutions persisted in modified forms, demonstrating that the fall was not a sudden annihilation, but a transformation of authority. This underscores a crucial point. External invasions acted as triggers, but the underlying causes of decline were deeply internal, built up over centuries of political, economic, and social erosion. The continuity of Roman structures under barbarian rule offers a window into the adaptive capacity of Roman civilization. Legal codes were maintained, administrative practices continued, and the Latin language endured in official and literary contexts. In many ways, the so-called invaders became inheritors and participants in a Roman system rather than destroyers of it. This phenomenon suggests that the empire's apparent collapse was less about the triumph of outsiders than the empire's inability to maintain centralized authority. Internal decay had weakened the state so significantly that external actors could step into its framework without the need for wholesale reconstruction. Military fragmentation illustrates this dynamic further. Federated armies, composed largely of non-Roman recruits, were often more loyal to their commanders than to the imperial center. These arrangements were initially pragmatic, addressing manpower shortages and frontier pressures. Over time, however, they diluted institutional loyalty and eroded the centralized command necessary for coordinated defense. Even when facing invasions, Western forces struggled to respond effectively, not simply because the enemy was formidable, but because internal cohesion had already fractured. The economic dimension of decline was equally significant. By the 5th century, trade networks were contracting, coinage was unstable, and urban centers had lost population and vitality. Local elites assumed greater control over resources, diminishing imperial reach. Tax collection became inconsistent, and logistical support for armies and administrators faltered. When invasions intensified, the empire's ability to mobilize resources and coordinate a response was compromised. In other words, external threats were amplified by internal weaknesses that had been developing for generations. Cultural and ideological changes also shaped the empire's trajectory. The Christianization of the Roman world created new forms of allegiance and community that sometimes competed with loyalty to the state. Bishops and church networks provided social services and mediated disputes, effectively substituting for some functions of civil administration. While this offered stability locally, it also reoriented social cohesion away from imperial structures. By the time of the empire's final years, the religious and cultural landscape had shifted in ways that further undermined centralized authority. Demography and public health compounded these challenges. Population decline due to plague, famine, and migration reduced both the labor force and the pool of military recruits. Urban contraction and rural depopulation weakened economic and administrative networks, reducing resilience to both internal disruption and external pressure. These slow-moving crises created vulnerabilities that invaders could exploit, demonstrating that structural decay rather than immediate violence was central to the empire's decline. Comparisons with the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived for nearly a millennium longer, highlight the critical importance of internal cohesion. Constantinople maintained strong administration, stable finances, and strategic defenses, allowing it to absorb shocks that the Western Empire could not. This contrast underscores that Rome's vulnerability was not solely the result of barbarian aggression, but of cumulative internal weakening. Collapse occurred where institutions failed to adapt to pressures, both internal and external. Ultimately, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is best understood as a protracted process of transformation, not a single catastrophic event. Political authority, military capacity, economic systems, social structures, and cultural frameworks all deteriorated incrementally. Invasions accelerated this process, but they were symptoms, not sole causes of the underlying fragility. Rome's collapse was the result of centuries of erosion, compounded by external pressures, rather than the sudden effect of foreign conquest. As we reflect on this history, it becomes clear that simple narratives of barbarians destroyed Rome fail to capture the complexity of the process. Internal decay created vulnerabilities, and external pressures exploited them. Authority shifted gradually from central institutions to local powers, from Roman generals to barbarian kings, and from civic structures to religious networks. The story of Rome's fall is one of incremental decline, adaptation, and transformation, illustrating how a civilization can endure in altered forms even as its political structures disappear. Returning to the questions raised at the beginning, Rome did not fall solely because of invasion, nor because of internal rot alone. It fell because internal decay had weakened the foundations upon which external forces could act. Political instability, economic contraction, social disengagement, military fragmentation, and ideological shifts created a system incapable of sustaining itself in the face of new pressures. Invasions were consequential, but they were the final accelerants in a centuries-long process of systemic decline. Rome's fall, therefore, is not a story of sudden destruction, but of gradual erosion. It challenges us to think about the interplay between internal fragility and external challenge, and about how civilizations transform rather than vanish entirely. Authority was never entirely lost. It was redistributed, reinterpreted, and absorbed by new actors within a changing landscape. Rome's legacy endured in law, language, and culture, even as the Western Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. In conclusion, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a complex, multidimensional process in which internal weaknesses and external pressures intersected. Invasion alone cannot explain the collapse, and internal rot alone does not account for the timing and manner of its final disintegration. Understanding Rome's decline requires attention to the slow accumulation of structural weaknesses, the adaptive responses of local elites, and the subtle but profound transformations in society, economy, and ideology. The story of Rome's fall reminds us that history is rarely simple, and that the most dramatic events often have deep, long-developing roots.